Up next on C-SPAN, our schedule continues with the remarks of novelist Gore Vidal, who spoke this week on Politics Today at the National Press Club in Washington.
The 2,600 cable systems affiliated with C-SPAN, the Cable Satellite Public Affairs Network. Before going further, I'd like to remind our members of some coming events. Tomorrow, on March 17th, we'll have with us Ambassador Quavis Maqsood, Chief Representative to the United States of the League of Arab States. On March 25th, we'll have author I.F. Stone with us. On March 28th, Panamanian opposition leader and editor Roberto Eisenman will be here. On March 29th, former California Representative Paul McCloskey will be with us in a joint appearance sponsored by the club and Sigma Delta Chi. And finally, on March 31st, Albert Shanker, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, will be here. I'd like to remind those of you in the audience that if you have questions for our speaker today, and I hope you will, please write them on the cards furnished at your tables and pass them up this way. I'll ask as many as time allows. I'd like now to introduce the guests at our head table. I ask our guests to please stand briefly when their names are read, and those of you in the audience, please hold your applause until all the names are read. Starting at my left and your right, Charles Trueheart, the Washington Post Style Section. Bob Wilson, USA Today book editor. Mary Ann Means, syndicated columnist for King Features and chairman of the Press Club's book and author sessions. Gil Klein, Media General Newspapers, and a member of the Press Club Board of Governors. Daniel J. Borston, author and Librarian of Congress, Emeritus. Going over our guests for a second to Greg Spears, regional reporter for Knight Ridder Newspapers and chairman of our Press Club Speakers Committee. Peggy Roberson, Hearst Newspapers, and the member of our committee who organized today's luncheon. Al Silverman, chairman and chief executive officer of the Book of the Month Club. Dr. Judith Patterson, University of Maryland, Department of Journalism, and Colin Waters, The Washington Times. Gore Vidal has been a full-time writer since 1944, when he wrote his first book aboard an Army freight supply ship in the Aleutian Islands. Since then, he has published more than 20 novels, dozens of plays, screenplays, television scripts, essays, and newspaper commentaries. Empire, his most recent novel, is a fictional chronicle of American history in a series that has also included Washington, D.C., Burr, 1876, and Lincoln. He has fashioned a career out of being outrageous and is widely regarded as one of the leading novelists of recent decades. His pronouncements are usually pungent, often controversial, and always interesting. Born Eugene Luther Vidal, he took Gore for his first name to honor his maternal grandfather, the late United States Senator Thomas Gore of Oklahoma. Our guest was born 62 years ago at the United States Military Academy at West Point, where his father was a noted aviation expert and an instructor. His grandfather, Senator Gore, was blind, and the young Vidal spent hours reading the congressional record and constitutional history to him. The Vidals lived with Senator Gore in Washington for several years. His parents were divorced during this time, and his mother married Hugh Auchincloss and moved with her son to Marywood, the Auchincloss estate in suburban Virginia. Later, Auchincloss also was a stepfather of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. He entered high school at the Los Alamos School in New Mexico, then transferred to Phillips Exeter Academy for 3 years of study that he describes as among the happiest of his life. He then joined the Army Reserve Corps. After being discharged in 1946, he worked as an editor in New York, but encouraged by the reception of his first novel, Willowa, he moved to Guatemala to concentrate on his writing. Several novels later, in 1947, he returned to New York to recover from a nearly fatal attack of hepatitis. While he recovered from that, he never quite completely got over the bite of the presidential bug, the political bug, and the presidential bug. He attended his first political convention with his grandfather at 14, and he freely admits to his lifelong passion to be president. In fact, he has said that, quote, nobody of this generation is better equipped, unquote, for that position. He combines his writing skills and political interests in sharp and penetrating essays that take apart the American political system and the government. In several essays, he has declared that both political parties and the government are essentially, quote, owned by the Chase Manhattan Bank and CBS. Most recently, he has provoked an outcry among many fellow Americans by elaborating on a theme that the American empire ended in September 1985 when he noticed that power shifted from New York to Tokyo as it had shifted from London in 1914 to New York. His disdain for our system, however, did not keep him from running for public office himself a couple of times. The first was in 1960 when he ran for a seat in the House of Representatives from New York, its 29th congressional district, while defeated on a platform that combined proposals for soaking the rich, recognizing mainland China, terrible idea, and federal aid for education. He won more votes than any Democrat in that district in the past half-century. And in 1982, he campaigned on an equally radical platform in his unsuccessful effort to win the Democratic nomination for the Senate in California. He advocated taxing church income, the nationalizing of natural resources, and the abolition of the present governmental system in favor of a parliamentary one. His fights with such writers as Norman Mailer and William Buckley also have become the stuff of literary legend. Today, Vidal divides his time between a villa in Italy and a Manhattan apartment. In a biography published several years ago, he insisted that his acid-tongued image is no pose. Quote, I'm exactly as I appear. There is no warm, lovable person inside. Even though he looks lovable. He went on to say that beneath my cold exterior, once you break the ice, you find cold water. That may be just one side of him. He likes to be photographed from only the left side, but today we are privileged to see him from all sides. Gore Vidal.
Well, as our president would say. I have obviously turned into a legend before my own eyes. I will not begin to correct the introduction, except that I have no apartment in Manhattan. It's a house in the Hollywood Hills. It's nice to be back in my native city. I was horrified, however, to see that Ronald Reagan's library has just burned down and that both books were destroyed. The real tragedy was he had not finished coloring the second one. He's absolutely wonderful. He, in Notre Dame the other day, he said to cheering throngs, because he thinks by now he was Newt Rockney or the Gipper, and he said, let's win this one for the Gippette. Nobody knows what he meant. I'm going to try and describe the State of the Union in about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll talk back and forth. I want to try and perhaps tell you something that you might not have thought about, and then I'll make a few proposals, and I expect standing ovations on each. Now, every now and then, usually while shaving, I realize that I have lived through nearly 1/3 of the history of the American Republic, which proves not how old I am, but how young the Republic is. The American Empire, which started officially in 1898 with the acquisition of the Philippines, came to a peak in the year 1945, while I was still a part of that army which had won political and economic mastery of two hemispheres. If anyone had said to me back then, when I was 20 years old, that the whole thing would be lost in my lifetime, I would have said it is not possible to lose so much so quickly without at least an atomic catastrophe. Yet looking back with hindsight, I can now see that our ending was implicit in our beginning. When Japan surrendered, the United States was faced with a choice. Either disarm, as we had done in the past, and enjoy the prosperity which comes from releasing so much wealth and energy to the private sector, or we could maintain ourselves on a full military basis, which would mean a tight control not only over our allies and such conquered provinces as West Germany, Italy, and Japan, but over the economic, which is to say the political lives of the American people. As Charles E. Wilson, a businessman politician of that era, said as early as 1944, instead of looking to disarmament and unpreparedness as a safeguard against war, a thoroughly discredited doctrine, let us try the opposite: full preparedness according to a continuing plan. The accidental President Harry Truman bought this notion. Although Truman campaigned in 1948 as an heir of Roosevelt's New Deal, he also had a continuing plan, but how to impose it. The Republican leadership did not like the state to be the master of the country's economic life, while of the Democrats, only a few geopoliticians like Dean Acheson found thrilling the prospect of a military state to be justified in the name of a holy war against something called communism in general, and Russia in particular. The fact that the Soviet Union was no military or economic threat to us was immaterial. They must seem to be threatening, so that the continuing plan could be set in motion in order to create the national security state in which we have been living for the past 40 years. What is the national security state? Well, it began officially and publicly with the National Security Act of 1947. It began secretly to be operative in January 1950, when the National Security Council produced a blueprint for a new kind of country, unlike anything that the United States had ever known before. This document, known as NSC 68 for short, was declassified only in 1975, commits us to the following program. They made 7 points. First, no negotiations ever with Russia. Second, develop the hydrogen bomb so that when the Russians finally develop an atomic bomb, we would still not have to deal with that enemy without which no national security state can exist. Third, a rapid buildup of conventional forces. Fourth, a large increase in taxes to pay for all this. Fifth, a mobilization of the entire American society to fight this terrible specter, hence Ronald Reagan's finest movie, The Red Menace of 1954. Sixth, a strong alliance system directed by the United States. This became NATO. Seventh, to make the people of Russia our allies in this holy adventure, hence the justification for all sorts of secret services, in no way responsible to the Congress that funds them, and so in violation of the old Constitution. Needless to say, the blueprint, the continuing plan, was never openly discussed at the time, but one by one, the major political players of the two parties came around. The Republican Senator Vandenberg told Truman that if he really wanted all those weapons and all those high taxes to pay for them, he'd better scare the hell out of the American people. Truman obliged, and so have all his successors, except briefly Eisenhower, who in a belated fit of conscience at the end of his presidency warned us against the military-industrial complex that had, by then, established permanent control over all our lives. The cynicism of this coup d'etat was breathtaking. Officially, we were doing nothing but trying to preserve freedom for ourselves and our allies from a ruthless enemy that was everywhere, monolithic and all-powerful. Actually, the real enemy, if that's the right word, was us for allowing our rulers to hijack the country, to impose military conscription, if only briefly, something unheard of in peacetime, to overthrow governments that did not please them, and finally to keep all but the very rich docile and jittery by imposing, as I once knew from personal experience, income taxes that used to go as high as 90%. That's quite an achievement for a country at peace. So we can date from January 1950 the strict governmental control of our economy and the gradual erosion of our liberties, so that this strange new state could control as much as possible everyone everywhere in the economic interest of what is never, to put it tactfully, a very large group. Fortunately, all bad things must end. Our huge indebtedness has made the maintenance of the empire a nightmare, and the day that Japan stops buying treasury bonds, our troops and missiles will all have to come home to a highly restless population, to overdo understatement. Now that I have defined this gloomy prospect, what solutions do I have? Well, I want to make 5 proposals, which we can then discuss back and forth. First, limit to 8 weeks presidential elections. That is what civilized countries usually do, and all democratic ones are obliged to do. Allow no candidate or party to buy time on television, radio, or in the newspapers. The media, always patriotic, must provide free time and space for the candidates to be interviewed in depth, to debate one another, to explain themselves. The current total corruption of our political system is due to the cost of campaigning, which is due to the cost, largely, of television advertising. Allow none of it. Give the people a break. Try democracy. You might get to like it. Second, the budget. I trust your eyes will not glaze over because you're going to get some figures. You, the press, and they, the politicians, constantly falsify the revenues and disbursements of the federal government. How? Social Security contributions and expenditures are counted by you as a part of the income of the federal government. This is not true. Social Security is an independent, slightly profitable, income-transferring trust fund. And so you've got to factor it out of federal revenue and federal spending. Why do you and the politicians conspire to give us a distorted view of the budget? Because neither you nor your employers or they, politicians and their owners, want the public to know how much of their tax money goes for a war that does not exist. As a result, Mr. Greenspan could say 2 weeks ago, with an absolutely straight face, there are only 2 options for a serious attack on the deficit. One is to raise taxes. The other is to reduce the entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare. He did not mention the defense budget at all. And he did not acknowledge that the so-called entitlements come from a special fund. But, of course, he is a disciple of Ayn Rand. You should get him on that subject here. In actual fact, close to 90% of the disbursements of the federal government go for what is laughingly known as defense. And I'll show you how. I'm working now with the 1986 budget. The gross revenue of the government was $794 billion. Of that amount, $294 were Social Security contributions. So subtract them from the money available to the national security state. That leaves $500 billion. Of the $500 billion, 286 goes to defense, 12 for foreign arms to our client states, 8 to energy, which means largely nuclear weapons, 27 for veterans' benefits, the sad and constant reminder of this national security state reckless career, and finally, $142 billion for interest on loans of money which was spent over the last 40 years to keep the national security state at war, hot or cold. So of 1986's $500 billion revenue, 475 was spent on national security state business. Of that amount, we will never know how much was given in PACs and so-called soft money to subsidize candidates and elections. Other federal spending, incidentally, came to $177 billion that year, which is about the size of the deficit. It is obvious that if we're not to suffer an economic collapse, the money for defense must be drastically reduced. But it is hard to reduce a budget that the people aren't told about. I've always had a hunch that the first politician who realizes why any politician who runs the government will not only win, as Carter and Reagan did, but he will be in a position to dismantle the national security state, which is what people truly hate without quite knowing it's there. You know, internal improvements was Henry Clay's highly popular movement over a century ago, out of which came a successful president, Abraham Lincoln. Well, I would suggest that the times require another Clay to restore our public educational system, collapsing roads and bridges, inner cities. That is where the money should be going, not to flounce about the Persian Gulf or try to overthrow a duly elected government in Nicaragua while running drugs, admittedly, the CIA's only margin of profit. Astonishing, by the way, in this morning's paper, there is Ronald Reagan looking absolutely rabid on the subject of, let us get rid of the president of Panama. Suppose President of Panama wants to get rid of him, you know, I think. Is he Panamanian? Third, as a part of our general retrenchment, we should withdraw from NATO. Western Europe is richer and more populous than we are. If they cannot defend themselves from an enemy who seem to be falling apart even faster than we are, then there is nothing that we, proud victors of Grenada that we are, could effectively do. I would stop all military aid to the Middle East, to Israel, to Jordan, to Egypt. This would oblige the hardliners in Israel to make peace with the Palestinians. We have supported Israel for 40 years, and I don't know of any other minority in the history of our country that has ever got so much treasury money, thanks to because of the arrangement between the Israel lobby and the national security state. Each supports the other, and I would like to rid the country of both because they cost too much. Fourth, we read each day about the horrors of drug abuse, the murder of policemen, the involvement of our own government in drug running, and so on. We are all aware that organized crime has never been richer, nor the society more demoralized. What is the solution? Everything seems to have failed. You can't obviously say just no. I would repeal every prohibition against the sale and use of drugs, because it is this prohibition that has caused the national corruption, not to mention most of the addiction. Since the American memory is about 3 days, I will remind you that in 1919, alcohol was prohibited in the United States. In 1933, the prohibition was repealed because not only had organized crime expanded enormously, but alcoholism as well. What did not work then does not work now. But we seem never to learn anything, which is part of our charm. Repeal would mean that there is no money for anyone in selling the drugs. So that's the end of the playground pusher. That's the end of the mafia, which is already diversified, in case you're sentimental about them. They're doing very nicely in banking, movies, dry cleaning, and politics. Eventually, repeal will mean the end of mass drug addiction, as there will always be alcoholics, there will always be drug addicts, but not to today's extent. Finally, it will be safe to walk the streets, because the poor will not rob you to get money to pay for their habit. Fifth, 2 years ago I described how the American empire ended the day the money power shifted from New York to Tokyo, and we became, for the first time in 71 years, a debtor nation. Since that speech, we have become the largest debtor country in history. I suggested a number of things that might be done, some of which I've just mentioned. But above all, I see our survival economically as inextricably bound up with that of our neighbor in the Northern Hemisphere, the Soviet Union. Some sort of economic alliance must be made between us so that together we'll be able to compete with the Japan-China hegemony. As the two klutzes of the North, the Soviet and ourselves, each unable to build a car that anyone wants to drive, we deserve each other. I propose this, what I've just said in a speech a year ago, February, in Moscow, where I attended Gorbachev's forum, anti-nuclear, and I gave a speech, and I quoted a Japanese minister of trade who said that Japan, beginning of the next century, would still be number one. Then he went on a little too long. He's a little tactless. He said the United States will be our farm, and Western Europe will be our boutique. One of the Russians got up and said, well, what did he say about us? And I said, he didn't mention you Russians, but I think you're going to be the ski instructors. It is my impression that the Russians, by and large, are eager to be Americans. But thanks to the brainwashing of the national security state's continuing plan, Americans have a built-in terror of the evil empire, which press and politicians have kept going for 40 years. So there are 5 simple proposals. They won't cost a penny. In fact, they'll save a lot of money. So will you, the press, and the politicians, do anything about this? Well, I'm always willing to be surprised. But even if you don't, events have now begun to take their course. The empire falls apart, and with it will go the national security state, which means, with a little bit of luck, we might get our country back.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal. A number of our guests in the audience are just dying to know, are you related to Senator Gore? And what do you think of his hope to be president?
The two are not necessarily coupled in my mind. The Senator Gore was Thomas Pryor Gore of Oklahoma, my grandfather. And he came originally from Mississippi and went out to Indian Territory, brought Oklahoma in the Union, was their first senator. In eastern Tennessee, there was a branch of the family to which young Albert belongs, and I knew his father, old Albert Gore, the senator. And he and my grandfather were friends, and they used to work out the relationship, which was something like fifth cousins. As young Albert grows more and more vocal in his support of the national security state, this cousinage is beginning to fray somewhat on my side, to the point of vanishing. But I did run into Senator Boren of Oklahoma the other day, and I asked him, I said, what's the kid like? And he said, he's all right. And he said, he's getting a little tired now. It's tough out there. And he said, what relation are you exactly? And I told him what I just told you. And he said, well, you know, it's very funny, but when he's in Oklahoma, he's Senator Gore's grandson, which everybody thought was you. They thought that I was elected in the primary there, nominated.
Someone asks, why didn't you run for president?
Nobody asked me. You can't have a serious political career in a country without political parties if you are serious about politics. If I were an unsuccessful anchor person who was never going to be networked, but was pretty good in Albuquerque, reading the weather, might well get sent to the Senate, or if I were a lawyer from Whittier, I might be hired, you know, to represent defense interests in the state of California like Nixon. But if you have any interest in real politics, if you notice, politics is the one subject you cannot mention, either in the press or in the campaign. There is only one subject, which is what we've been talking about today. That's the defense budget. That's the only subject. No one has said a word about it. 4 years ago, I was very pro-Jesse Jackson, who came out 20% cut in the defense budget. And I said, well, he's on the right track. Now Jesse, as the crown slowly descends upon his head, is getting, turning moon glow blonde on us. I mean, he's going to be, he's going to be another George Bush. And one of those per national security state is quite enough.
One of our guests asks, would you please give a one-sentence profile of Reagan, Bush, and Dole? And after that, we'll ask you about a few Democrats.
Well, there's no... I start welling right away when you... They are in place to keep this continuing plan going. But as we have run out of money, we're some $2 trillion in debt, and we've also run out of energy, and eventually Reagan will save his reputation, what little is left of it as far as history goes, by having to go to the heart of the evil empire and make some sort of a peace. And Gorbachev is now the most popular man around world politician. They've all run out of gas. They only had one thing to talk about for the last 40 years. The Russians are coming. They didn't talk about anything else. Everything was negative. They never said, well, we've got a very good country here, but maybe we should be doing better at education. Why is it that we have dropped to number 27 in the world in quality of life? We're number 24 among book readers. Why did this happen? They don't talk about that. It's worse in Russia, they tell us. Oh, yeah, well, it's worse in Zaire, too. But what's one got to do with the other? So you asked me about the three Republicans, and they have done the job thus far that they've been hired to do. Reagan was elected president by the new rich end of the grand old party, and it was to cut corporation taxes totally, which he practically got away with for a while, cut income taxes for his wealthy friends, and make sure that the Pentagon continues to get 90% of the budget in order to support the national security state. He's done just that. And meanwhile, I don't want to walk down the streets here at night, and you can't drive anywhere without having your head broken open because of the potholes. I think of that operation of this Republican administration as a kind of wrecking operation, like those people who go in to strip a company of its assets. Well, they just sold the film library.
Many of our people in the audience are interested in your assessment of the presidential candidates on both sides of the aisle. Could you give us a feel for if there's anybody that you like or who would be least objectionable?
Well, since the next president is going to be Herbert Hoover, no matter what his name is, I was telling some really, really bigoted Southern friends of mine, members of my family indeed, I said, so you were scared of a black president. This is your opportunity. Make him president. Poor Jesse's going to have to sit there with the biggest collapse economically the world's ever seen. They say, see, weren't we right? They can't run the place. I think all the chickens have come home to roost. And you see, with the national security state, we got a glimpse of it, and nobody seemed to get the point to the Iran-Contra hearings. To the extent that they would allow us to find out anything, there was a CIA man sitting there every day to keep this thing under control. We have two governments. We have the real government, which is national security, and Ali is not an aberration. Ali is the rule. Kissinger was giggling over Ali on television because Kissinger was doing the same thing when he was in charge there. Then you have the diversion for the dummies. the 4-year presidential campaigns. Is he cheating on his wife? Did he dye his hair? Are those his eyebrows? I mean, to read you all, you'd think it was a bunch of absolute cretins out there. As a result of this, 50% of the people don't vote at all, and I'm one of them. Last vote I cast was for Lyndon Johnson, the peace candidate. I've never been such a fool since. I'd say the best of the lot, curious enough, is Jackson. He does have a kind of plan. He has some grasp. I don't think any of this is very clear to him, but I don't think it's very clear to the others either, about what the national security state means and how you dismantle it. Nothing that powerful that has been in office that long is going to give up very easily. So whatever president is going to have to use some kind of an emergency measure, which usually, when countries change drastically their form of government, they do it either because they lose a war, God help us we don't do that, or there's an economic crash, which I predicted October 19th, about a year ago. I predicted some other ugly things, and let me tell you, the four most beautiful words in the English language are, I told you so.
This member of our audience writes, why do you not think that the very existence of nuclear weapons and troops has not contributed to the fact that we have had peace since World War II?
That is, as they say, moot. I don't think nuclear weapons kept the peace. I think nuclear weapons make the world more dangerous. The peace was going to be kept because what motive would the Russians have to march into Europe? That was the thing. We were so busy. This is all for internal consumption. Harry Truman was thinking about elections. He wasn't thinking about protecting the country from communism. I mean, the communists have never been much of a threat to us. Yes, they are to their neighbors. Their neighbors have been rich and well-organized, powerful, for the last 20 years. Nuclear weapons, you know, Gorbachev said something very interesting at this plenum, and I'm as impervious to political rhetoric as anybody, having been brought up in this town, including my own. But I must say, Gorbachev really caught my attention. There we were, about 1,000 of us, some 700 worthies, non-communists, interested in getting rid of nuclear weapons, sitting in the great hall of the Kremlin. It was like being dead, you know, you'd already gone to hell. I had Norman Mailer on my right and Pierre Trudeau on my left. And there was Yoko Ono up ahead. And there was Gorbachev speaking. And I mean, I said, Norman, I'm going mad. I mean, are you having this dream too? Anyway, Gorbachev said, you know, Chernobyl frightened us. Now, could you imagine Ron saying 3 Mile Island really upset us? No, we're always standing tall. It's always, you know, he knows he's talking to what he thinks are very dumb people. And I must say, since they elected him, perhaps they are. But everything's always just fine here. It's just always good news. And then Gorbachev extrapolated from that. He said, look, the fallout from that has been terrible, and it's been immeasurable. I know. I have a house in southern Italy. I have had permanently damaged sinus since the day the cloud hit us. And you could tell the animals, dogs, cats would come in coughing. We all had red eyes. And I mean, you know, we had been hit. And who knows what, a baby was just born in Naples 2 weeks ago with 2 heads and is doing very well. So Chernobyl frightened him. His fear really was, he said, that can happen with one small reactor going wrong. What happens if one of our missiles or one of the Americans blows up? You can't use these things tactically. I mean, first of all, nobody knows if they'll work. You press the button, and suddenly you've blown up Chicago because it's gone the wrong way. Nobody ever knows. Have you ever seen a piece of machinery that worked? A computer that worked? I wouldn't trust anything. There's a famous story about Carter when he came to the White House and they were showing him all the apparatus of the emperor. And this is what you press to get SAC, and you do this and you do that. And if Air Force One is always standing by or something, there's a military plane that will take you out, has the whole government at your fingertips. You press it and it's ready for you in 10 minutes. So Carter said, all right, I'll press it. Well, 2 days later, he was on the telephone to the Pentagon. Nothing had ever happened. They said, "Oh, well, I think we changed the tapes, Mr. President," or something.
If you were president starting next January, what would your priorities be?
Well, I would certainly put under review the Pentagon budget. I would also make a general announcement about every member of the House and every member of the Senate, how many defense establishments there were in his district, and how much money he might be getting from them, which would explain to the people at large why he voted the way he did. And then you would start cutting back. I think that's the first move. I'd be very tempted, this will come as a shock to all but older people here, but I'd be tempted to get rid of the CIA. We were very successful before it was invented. I remember when the empire was going very well. And the CIA is something that no democratic society should sustain. It's secret. I once asked Birch Bayh, who was chairman of the Joint Committee overseeing them, and I said, "Did they tell you the truth?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, why don't you find out? Why don't you ask them?" He said, "Well, how can you check on them?" The Constitution requires that every government bureau submit at regular intervals its accounts. It never does, nor does the Defense Intelligence Agency. The FBI tends to run a little free. I'd look after those secret societies. And then I would do a massive, massive, massive infusion of money into the educational system. It's just too damned embarrassing what's happened to our people. It's embarrassing to an American, at least my age. Maybe younger people don't care, but it bothers me that they don't know any history, they don't know any politics, they don't know any geography. I get to see them when I'm in Italy, I get to see them in California, and they're just blank. They have no references. And they aren't dumb. I mean, intelligence is the same from generation to generation, but they are ignorant because they haven't been taught.
You've spoken out before on AIDS and the fears that have arisen because of it. One questioner asks, do you think homophobia is at the root of the Reagan administration's inattentiveness to the AIDS crisis?
I would suppose so. I don't know much about what the present administration is doing on that subject. It seems to me that as a diabolic plague, it's an awfully small one and you have to work overtime to catch it. I'm rather stunned by all the fuss the press has made over it. Yes, it's a terrible thing. It's an unusual one because if you get cancer, you're just as apt to live as not. This one seems to be quite terminal. The fact that there is an enormous, to use a word I detest, gay population out there voting has caused great distress in many quarters, so this is a marvelous way of backlash. You know, that's why I brought up that business about drugs. Any authoritarian society, and this is one, must invent prohibitions, whether they be about drugs or alcohol or sex, so that they then have the power to arrest people and hold them, detain them, frighten them. That's what it's all about. Blood test you, urinalysis you, lie detector tests for you. What kind of country is this? None of this happened before. This is all part of what I've been talking about, and it's something that just happened to us. We're living in a George Orwell country, and nobody will talk about it.
Would you offer us your analysis of American TV evangelism?
Well, I nearly won the primary in California against Jerry Brown when I came out for taxing the religions you've never seen. I got 500,000 votes just on that. We could get rid of them in a minute if you taxed all religions. Because, you know, the idea that you don't tax them, that was meant church property in the old days, or temple property, the little white church at the corner of Elm. You didn't do a property tax. It did not mean the portfolio of billions of dollars. One of the reasons the inner cities have collapsed is that the churches and temples own too much real estate there and do not pay tax on it to the municipality. The TV and evangelicals are great fun, and I'm all for them. I see one of them is in town now, Elmer Gantry, and welcome, Elmer. I think they tend to self-destruct. Their fans are maybe 10, 20 million people. But if you got to send that money for Jesus, send that money for Jesus, send that money, come here, you know, and they wave at the audience through the television tube. I should have a man from the IRS sitting right there beside the Reverend Swaggart getting our cut.
How has the Washington you portrayed in your novel, Washington, changed today?
Well, I have described Washington from 1800 on. I've got in Washington, D.C., I got as late as sort of 1953 or 4. You can follow the evolution of the city, certainly in the books. It gets bigger. I'll give you a symbolic change that is very noticeable to somebody my age. Before the war, Second World War, everybody knew everybody else. It's a very small town. And I used to be sent down when I was around 10 years old to pick up my grandfather and bring him home to lunch. And in those days, you took off your shoes in June, and school let out, and you didn't put them back on until September. And on very hot days, you wore a bathing suit. So I get in the car with the driver, and we go down to the Senate, and I'm wearing just a bathing suit. And I wandered into the Capitol, no guards to stop you. The one Capitol guard by the swinging door thought this was kind of funny and let me in. And I go down the aisle, and there are about 20 senators there, and John Nance Garner sitting up there in the chair. My grandfather, being blind, couldn't see anything. People started to chuckle. I said, "Come on home, you're late. Lunch is ready." And he got up, took my arm, and I always wore short shirts, didn't feel anything strange. And suddenly Garner came down from his throne. He said, "Senator, that boy is naked." And everybody roared with laughter. My grandfather was mortified. Possibly that's why I never got to the Senate. But that's one symbol to me, and the other was very distinctly the imperial presidency. The head, before the national security state, the president was a casual figure. He was treated with great courtesy, but as you know from the press club, when Warren Harding would wander over here to play cards, it was pretty relaxed. And I remember the exact change was when the war started, where the president before would go out to dinner, even though it was difficult for FDR, but he would occasionally. It was a great casualness. There were only a couple of guards, really. And suddenly the troops surround the White House, and more troops. And the Pentagon is built. And suddenly you see this thing being turned into some kind of bunker. And now the whole thing is, if it weren't for the Disneyland charm of the current incumbent, it would look like Genghis Khan over there.
Do you have any concern that readers of, say, Lincoln will better remember your account than they will remember what historians have had to say about Lincoln in his era? In other words, that your fiction becomes fact?
Well, I think that my fiction is fact in the case of Lincoln. I draw on the best historians. I don't have Lincoln say or do, in principle, anything that he did not say or do in life. I'm rather stricter about that than certain biographers I can name. And I think the book is, well, I think it's useful now. It gives an idea of what it was like when there was a real country, when there was real political debate, when there were real issues. And after all, the Civil War was to us what the Trojan War was to the Greeks. And Lincoln is to us what Ulysses was to them. I mean, this is the great event of our history. And I think that readers will get quite a fair view of him. Two minor historians took me to task not long ago, and I read through very carefully their list of charges. Well, they didn't have anything at all. One of them once said that I used the word trolley in 1860, didn't come in until 1890. He was right on that one. It was very trivial stuff, but there is a serious point to some of the criticism, is that these people are in the business, many of these academics, of creating plaster saints. They are hagiographers. Well, there's certain things, they have to keep redoing the saint for every generation. Now, in the age of Martin Luther King, you cannot emphasize that Abraham Lincoln wanted to colonize the slaves in Liberia or Nicaragua. New Granada, it was called then. I have that. It's going to be in the TV series is on November 27th and 8th. I just saw it with Sam Waterston Jr. and Mary Tyler Moore, and it's, to my amazement, it's wonderful. Usually I have to go around telling people not to watch these things, but this turned out very well. And what is going to startle a lot of people and trouble the hagiographers is you see Lincoln right to the end of his life saying there is no way the hatred between the two races, whatever the reason may be, I don't know. It's beyond anything I can fathom or deal with. And it is better that they live apart. And there's a marvelous scene, beautifully acted in the mini-series in which he's trying to persuade some black leaders from the North, free men, to persuade the slaves, once freed in the South, to leave the United States. And the man said, well, why should they leave here? This is their home. After all, they've been here since the beginning. And Lincoln went into, well, you know, the feeling against them. And how are they going to live? He said they aren't educated and so on. This man said, well, they've supported themselves and their masters in luxury for 200 years. I think without supporting the white masters, they'd be all right. Lincoln never thought of an answer to that one.
Are there other current writers of fiction who you admire, and who would they be?
I don't keep up that much with fiction. These days I have to read so much history for what I'm writing. I'm currently doing 1917 to 1923, which is why I know all about Warren Harding and the Press Club. So I'm mostly reading history. I think the best writer of my lifetime was an Italian, Italo Calvino. He is superb. There's nobody like him. Of my American contemporaries, Saul Bellow is really the only one I can say that I really admire, and he's the only one you can talk to about something other than advances and, at our age, illnesses. Saul, you can talk ideas to. I don't want to be invidious, so the list stops there.
What should Americans do to make sure their children are educated to be participants in the U.S. democratic experience?
Well, the parents must see to it that they have good elementary and high schools. And how you do that, if there's no money, if all the money is going for Star Wars, I mean, I don't know how you do it if you don't have the teachers and you don't have the schools. You would also have to teach American history, which I've never thought, even in my day, wasn't very well taught. Because it's really teaching you how to adjust yourself to the society without ever telling you what the society is all about. So there was always a tendency to glorify ourselves. Every country does that. But I would make the teaching of history the spine of any educational system. I'd start in the first grade and give them the Big Bang. I'd give them the Garden of Eden. I'd give them anything, you know, because it's fun, you know, all these theories about the origin, because nobody knows. Then you move along so that by the time they're in the last year of high school, they have the whole history of the world is taught them, East as well as West. So they'll get China, they'll get Japan. So that in their last year, they're up to date. They're getting contemporary events. That means they'll leave the school and they'll have a knowledge of what the human race has done from the beginning to now. I mean, it's not going to be a very deep one, but it's certainly going to be a very general one, so they know where they are. I remember when I was in school thinking, you know, I read a lot as a kid, and I said, when are we going to get to the Roman Empire? I said, we're not getting to it. Oh. I said, well, we've got 6 years here of American history, but my gosh, there's so much other history. Well, you're not getting it. And then they said, you're lucky you're not in the state of New York. They teach 4 years of the history of the state of New York. A lugubrious subject.
Somebody asks, do you believe that the world is ripe for caveism?
Caveism is an inside joke. I wrote a novel, 1954, called Messiah. How a man appears, he's a sort of, kind of a swaggart type, and but he's got a new religion based on death, on suicide. That death is no thing, and as the and this was written before overpopulation became a problem, and he persuades people that it is good to die. And he starts a world religion out of this, and he does it through television, through the power of television. And as the years have passed, it's been a cult book for 30 years now, and as the years pass, it seems to get more and more readers, and you take Cave's Way, which means you go to, that part was stolen by a movie called Soylent Green. I've been a quarry for others, but they took that part out where they go to a place in order to commit suicide under very nice circumstances, beautiful psychedelic illustrations, music, and so on. That's taking Cave's Way. No, I don't think the world is ready yet for Cave's Way. The irony of the book was neither was Cave. When they finally said, listen, to make this religion work, you've got to kill yourself. He said, I know I'm not going to. So they kill him.
Some folks here enjoyed your convention commentary in, I guess it was 84?
64.
64, the political conventions. They asked, can we get you to return with perhaps Mailer or Bill Buckley in 88?
Well, we live, as you know, in a free country, and as I've been explaining to you, in 1964, William F. Buckley Jr. and I were hired by ABC to comment on the two conventions, Republicans in Miami, Democrats in Chicago. We had a half-hour live, unrehearsed, as some of you will remember. And the two of us made ABC #1 in the ratings for the first time in the history of ABC. Viewers couldn't believe it. Well, I said the unsayable very early. I said there's no difference between the two parties. You can't say that on primetime television because everybody's there to keep this myth going, to keep this diversion while the national security state does its work elsewhere. So I wasn't playing the game. I have never been asked back to comment on a national election by any network, and Bill is always asked back. Now, to show you how freedom works, I ran into Peter Jennings at a party not long ago, and he was just a kid in '64 in Chicago. And Peter said, oh, gosh, it'd be wonderful for old time's sake. Do you want to come back and comment about the election before last? I said, sure, I'd love to. And I sat by the phone day after day, and it never rang. Then Peter Jennings and his wife came to see me last summer in Italy, and I said, oh, I'm still waiting for that call. He said, well, the ship has sailed. They will never take you.
Mr. Vidal, we've come near the end of our allotted time here. On behalf of the Press Club, I'd like to give you a certificate of our appreciation, paperweight for whatever use you might be able to make of it, and a final question. Several people are interested. Is there another political race in your future?
No.
Thank you. That ends our luncheon.
You've been watching novelist Gore Vidal speak at the National Press Club in Washington. For information about this or other National Press Club programs, please write to 529 14th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20045.
Join C-SPAN as retired journalist and author I.F. Stone